Okay.
Rich Gilmore.
Rene,
Mate, good to see you.
thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Tell me, how's your COP going? And what are your takeaways so far?
I've been really surprised, given all the noise in the carbon market over the past, call it 6 to 12 months.
Yep.
I came here with maybe mixed expectations. That's certainly been true. You know, there's been a lot of and continues to be a lot of scrutiny of carbon market, and we welcome that. And a lot of that's concern has been coming from, say, buyer countries, wealthy countries. If you talk to the countries in the global south who actually stand to benefit from and really need this, I'd say how to participate in the carbon market at scale is one of the 2 or 3 things that is most on their minds. The other ones being obviously loss and damage and climate finance for the transition more broadly. So 4 days in, I'm actually feeling pretty positive about how carbon markets are going to be playing a role going forward.
You mentioned, in particular, the opportunity here for developing nations, effectively the global south, to participate in carbon markets.
Yeah.
Can you quantify that for me?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at announcements that have been made by Kenya, later this week in Nigeria, the West African countries, they really see this as a transformational export opportunity for their economies. Not only, to provide the clean air, the abundant food, the clean energy, all of those things that carbon projects finance, but to earn real export dollars in hard currency. And that's why they're so keen, not just to be working on their supply side and making sure that the supply side has integrity, infrastructure, but really putting pressure on the demand side.
Yeah.
There's lots of criticism of the voluntary carbon market, some of it warranted, some of it not. Where we really should be focused is on the 99.5% of emissions that are currently unabated.
Yep.
I think it is ethically irresponsible, ethically indefensible to emit a single tonne of CO2 without compensation when we are already 70 parts per million of CO2 past the safe limit. I think the principle should be you pollute, you pay every tonne, every time, and you do so in a way that recognises the resource sovereignty of the nations in which are going to be providing those solutions.
How do we do that? How do we get to that pollute pays principle? Right?
I think there's a behavioural, part of that is going to come from regulation. And so the EU ETS, for example, and the proliferation of those regulated schemes, but they don't get you all the way.
Sure, but then that's an extension of what, CBAM?
CBAM is a good one, right? So CBAM is, I think, really smart policy. It says really high price of carbon could make manufacturing in Europe less competitive. So given 2 pathways there, that rather than saying let's reduce the price of carbon in Europe, they say let's raise the price of carbon everywhere else. And you'll see tit for tat, CBAMs being put in place so there's not tax leakage across the world. Yep. That's a really smart policy intervention. It doesn't get you all the way. It only catches some sectors and some emissions. And so if you take the 2 principles, that you pollute, you pay, every tonne, every time, and the principle of resource sovereignty, you're a polluting company, you say, I need to make this investment, is decision 1. Decision 2 is, I need to make this investment in a way in which authentically I'm trying to solve the social, ecological and climatic problems of the host country in which I'm investing. Not going to that country with the mindset of how can I reduce my emissions as cheaply as possible.
Yeah.
It's how can I reduce my emissions cost effectively, but in a way that recognises that these are the sovereign resources of the host country, and it should be incumbent on those companies to be making those investments with that mindset.
Okay. I completely agree, right? You preach to the converted, but so now playing devil's advocate here.
Yeah.
So right now there's this issue with regards to just confidence in the market that's been undermined deliberately by certain sectors, right? Some well-intentioned and some that is deliberate in terms of throwing sand in the gears.
Yeah.
So how does the industry combat that in terms of the communications piece? How do we ensure that outcome is not the perverse inaction, but it's the actual result that you want?
I don't want to undermine the significance of any integrity concerns, but those things are being resolved, and overall, the market actually works in a pretty robust way.
Yeah, no doubt.
And you've really got to keep in mind what's being criticised. It's not that a wind farm that was supposed to be built wasn't, or that the forest that was supposed to be protected wasn't. Those things are observable at low cost in real time.
Yeah,
what we're talking about is inside baseball, carbon accounting, which the integrity standards or the crediting bodies correct for over time. We have better information now, and so we adjust standards going forward. And Vera has announced that they're putting a pathway in place to adjust issuances historically, if that's what projects want to do. And so the ICVCM, the VCMI, SBTI, all the other stuff is being put in place, which removes, I think, the ability for companies to hide behind some question of integrity to justify taking no action. I would say that every sophisticated company in the world already has all the information that they need to responsibly measure, abate, and offset their emissions. And if they're not doing it, they're just making a choice. It's an explicit choice that says, I should be allowed, or I believe I should be allowed, to keep polluting without penalty. And I think that in a climate emergency is completely indefensible.
So how do we? I completely agree, but how do we ensure against that perverse outcome, right? If the regulators aren't supportive, if there aren't sort of a coalition of the willing, effectively, to be able to do this, and also a reticence of being reprimanded for the actual voluntary action, being kind of status quo right now, how do we move away from that? How do we ensure that we can get civil society, the media, and the private sector effectively all acting in unison to actually deliver on positive?
So we talked about a moment ago about what's being put in place to actually ensure that there continues to be high integrity in the market through initiatives like the ICVCM and VCMI. I think the other thing we need to do is really do a better job of communicating the impact that climate finance can have and that carbon markets can have. And we're doing a poor job of elevating the voices who benefit from what this market does. And so nobody really wants to hear, from a bunch of, middle-aged white guys like me about why the carbon market is important.
So who do we need to hear from?
What they want to hear from is the women in Africa who aren't being struck down by lung disease or can't work or be educated because they're gathering firewood. And that clean cook stoves give them those opportunities. We need to be hearing from the indigenous people in the Amazon whose cultural and spiritual practices are protected because nature is protected, and that the carbon market is making that happen. We need to hear from, farmers in Turkey who, rather than washing their animal effluent into a river, can now be paid for that effluent to generate clean energy. Yes, a ton needs to be a ton, but we also need to elevate the stories of the impact that this market is delivering, because it's currently the only mechanism that we have to deliver it.
Okay, I like that, and it's quite optimistic. But it basically defines, which would you agree with their statement, but essentially carbon is a very malleable commodity in this case. It allows for all of those stories, all of those impacts to be measured, but effectively it has one common currency, being the ton of carbon.
Yeah, there is a common currency being a ton of carbon, but I would say that carbon is going to become simultaneously more and less commoditized. So more exchanges, more standardized contracts, but those standardized contracts will, for example, have smaller baskets of projects within them that meet a minimum integrity standard or a CCP label, for example. So,
and then things trade at basis to that.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Yeah, you can make a risk-based decision about whether you want to buy a carbon credit that's AA rated or a carbon credit that's BBB rated, and you'll be making a risk-based and financial-based decision, to get to that point. But all of those credits will have a base level of confidence, in particular through the higher standards, newer methodologies, and the roles of groups like the ICVCM.
Great. Thanks, Rich.
Thanks, Rene.
Yeah,
Cheers, mate.
Thank you.
Enjoy your COP.